So when Dr. Mosier first asked me to present on the history of the English Reformation for you this morning, I thought it might be best to first explain to you why I myself am an Anglican. Because the reason I chose to be confirmed and later ordained in the Anglican Communion is inherently tied to the Anglican history. So perhaps it goes without saying, but I did not grow up as an Anglican. In fact, if you had told me 10 years ago I would have been ordained a priest today, I probably would have given you a very concerned look. Probably because I would have thought, there's no way I'd ever be Catholic. I have a running joke with myself, though, and it's that my Southern Baptist seminary made me an Anglican. Now, of course, that's a gross oversimplification. They, in fact, simply gave me the tools to read myself out of the tradition. A major aspect of it, though, was that I met a certain seminary professor, who shall remain nameless, who first introduced me to the concept of Reformed Catholicity. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, it simply is a reference to the Protestant Reformers' aim to restore the church to its Catholic roots, while rectifying certain errors that had crept in over time. So rather than creating a new faith or a new denomination or religion, reformers like Luther sought to reclaim what he saw as the core truths and practices of the early Christian church. And that concept really stuck with me. Having grown up in a very tradition-less church, the idea that we share in a common heritage with the apostles and the faith and the doctrine that they passed down was incredibly appealing to me. And so it was that when I went to study in the UK, I found a church that was part of the Church of England tradition, where I finally found my ecclesiastical home. Because up to that point, one of the main issues I was wrestling with was sacramental theology and how to best understand the practice of communion. But it wasn't until I attended a communion service at an Anglican church and I heard the vicar read the words of an institution from the Book of Common Prayer that it finally clicked for me, and I finally felt like I found what I was looking for. And so these aspects of Reformed Catholicity, the Book of Common Prayer, and the Eucharist are those same aspects, I think, that help shape the English Reformation. So, what is Anglicanism? Well, the very word Anglican comes from the Latin Anglicanus, meaning of England, and it designates the Church of England and the wider Anglican communion, which is now found around much of the entire world. So to be an Anglican is simply to belong to the, quote, English church. Now, the term Episcopalian is in many ways interchangeable with Anglican from a connotation standpoint. The word episcopal is rooted in the Greek episkopos and is used to refer to an overseer or a bishop. And so an Episcopalian is somebody who ascribes to a church polity that has bishops. But how did the Anglican Church begin? That's what we are focusing on today. Because the Anglican Church came out of the English Reformation, which centered around the story of King Henry VIII, who became the catalyst for the Reformation taking off in England. Now, the irony is that King Henry VIII was no friend to the reformer Martin Luther. Big surprise there. In fact, Henry actually threw himself into the church's campaign against Luther's ideas. He even commissioned his court theologians to write the Defense of the Seven Sacraments, which was a theological treatise aimed at defending the Roman Catholic faith against certain Lutheran teachings. And because of his efforts, King Henry was given the title, the Defender of the Faith, by the Pope at the time. Now, I think there's actually a deep irony in that title for us today, because that same title, which was given for the defense of Roman Catholic teaching, is still used in British coronation ceremonies today. But of course, it is applied to the Protestant Church of England, of whom the monarch of England is considered the head of. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. But Henry's religious convictions were in tension with his political ambitions. His quarrel with the Roman Catholic Church took shape in the 1520s when Pope Clement VII refused to annul his marriage to his wife, Catherine of Aragon. You see, Henry was desperate for a male heir, but was unable to have one. And so he began to suspect that God disapproved of his marriage to Catherine because he married his sister-in-law. Now, of course, this was only after his older brother Arthur had first passed away, but nonetheless, Henry felt that God disapproved of it and was disciplining him by not giving him a male heir. And so, as such, King Henry VIII sought the Pope's endorsement for an annulment of his marriage, a request that was rooted perhaps both in conviction, but probably and more undoubtedly in his affection for his soon-to-be wife, Anne Boleyn. And while it is not the usual practice of the Catholic Church to annul a marriage, the decision of Pope Clement might have been as political as it was theological. Many in the bureaucracy of Rome were already infuriated with the English for their reluctance to defend Europe against the Turks, and as such played a major part in the obstruction of the annulment of the Aragon marriage by putting pressure on the Pope. The Pope's denial, though, to annul the marriage pushed Henry to search for an alternative solution. After tasking the same court theologians who wrote his treatise against Luther to research ways to fix his problem, Henry found precedence in King Arthur to assert that he was the supreme head of the church within his realm, not the Pope. And so with the guidance of his Protestant-minded chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, this claim became formalized through the Act of Supremacy in 1534, establishing the English monarch as head of the church in England. This break then with Rome marked Henry as the first king to cut ties with papal authority during the Reformation. Now, a little bit about Thomas Cranmer, because we cannot fully understand the English Reformation without recognizing Thomas Cranmer's place in it. Cranmer was a reserved diplomat. He was a priest and a Cambridge scholar who had grown sympathies for reform. During a diplomatic mission to Nuremberg, Germany, however, Cranmer met and befriended the prominent Lutheran theologian Andreas Osiander, who went on to influence Cranmer so much that Cranmer even married Osiander's niece, which nullified his celibacy vows taken at his ordination and solidified his commitment to this new Lutheran Protestant cause. And while this personal and theological transformation was radical, Cranmer kept his marriage quiet upon returning to England because he found himself in the position to become the next Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest ecclesiastical position in the realm of England. Thomas Cranmer kept his Protestant leanings hidden for a time so that he could maneuver his way around the Vatican loopholes and be consecrated as the Archbishop by their approval. But upon his consecration as the Archbishop, Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine annulled, thereby distancing himself from Rome officially. Now, Cranmer's passion for reform extended far beyond this one act, and sometimes the English Reformation, unfortunately, is centered just around the annulment of King Henry's divorce. But Cranmer's passion for the reform extended beyond that, as he began reshaping the church's worship. Perhaps his most enduring legacy is the Book of Common Prayer, introduced in 1549 and later revised in 1552 by Cranmer, which set the standard for English worship in the vernacular. Its creation marked a significant departure from the Roman Catholic practices of the day, aiming to establish a uniquely English form of Christian worship. The goal was to offer a liturgical text in English rather than in Latin, making services accessible to all English-speaking worshipers, thereby reflecting the Reformation's principles of understanding and participation from the laity. Cranmer's primary influence for the Book of Common Prayer came from the medieval Sarum Rite, which was a variant of the Roman Rite used in Salisbury, England, alongside insight from other European liturgical sources. Cranmer incorporated some elements from Lutheran liturgies, but most especially relied on the works of Martin Butzer and the influence of Peter Martyr Vermigli, both of whom were sympathetic to the Reformation ideals and contributed to Cranmer's theological vision. However, the Roman Missal, which was the standard liturgical book of the Roman Catholic Church used for Roman Catholic Mass, remained the primary traditional source that Cranmer revised. And in creating the Book of Common Prayer, Cranmer streamlined complex services from the Roman Missal and other services into a unified format, reducing the liturgical day to two principal services, morning and evening prayer, the daily office, which is something Anglicans still pray this day, and in ordination vows, ministers vowed to pray every single day themselves. The prayers and structures in the BCP maintained a familiar rhythm, but it diverged significantly, though, from the Roman Missal by eliminating repetitive prayers, adjusting doctrines, especially those concerning the Eucharist, and removing the veneration of saints to align more with the Protestant doctrines and ideals. Cranmer's 1549 version, while relatively conservative, evolved by 1552 to reflect a more reformed theology, emphasizing the sufficiency of Scripture, justification by faith alone, and the priesthood of all believers. Though distinct, the BCP retained echoes of the Roman Catholic Missal in both form and style. For example, the Collect for Purity, which I know you pray here on Sunday mornings, and various canticles bear a resemblance to Catholic prayers, but were rephrased to reflect Anglican theological priorities. Additionally, Cranmer helped develop the Book of Homilies as part of the Anglican formularies as a response to a practical and theological challenge during the early days of the English Reformation. Namely, many priests in the Church of England who were formerly Catholic, often with limited training in Protestant preaching, and some who even had little formal education in any theological matters. As the Church of England transitioned from Roman Catholicism to a Reformed Protestant identity, it emphasized preaching and the exposition of Scriptures, moving away from the Catholic focus on the sacramental ritual alone. However, the clergy's uneven training posed a problem, as many were not equipped to preach in line with Reformed theology, or to lead congregations with sermons that were doctrinally consistent with this new English church. So the Book of Homilies was designed in a like manner to Luther's larger catechism. Luther faced that same problem in Germany, and so the larger catechism functioned as a way to teach the priests as they taught their people. So the Book of Homilies was first published in 1547 and consisted of a collection of sermons on key Protestant doctrines and teachings. It provided ready-made, theologically sound sermons that clergy could read aloud to their congregations. This ensured that all parishioners, regardless of their priest's personal ability or theological training, would hear consistent teachings on foundational topics of faith and Christian conduct. Cranmer's theological contributions were also found in the 42 Articles, which formed the basis for the 39 Articles, the doctrinal standard of the Church of England and the Anglican Communion around the world still today. But shifting gears now away from Thomas Cranmer, because if Cranmer was the theological mind behind much of the reform in the English Church, Thomas Cromwell was the statesman who made it possible. Cromwell was instrumental in securing a key piece of legislation called the Act of Supremacy, which established the English Church with the king rather than the Pope as its supreme head. Henry delegated much of this new authority to Cromwell, giving him the role of vicegerent in spirituals. As the vicegerent, Cromwell spearheaded the dissolution of all English monasteries, a policy that not only enriched the crown, but significantly curtailed the traditional influences of the Catholic Church in England. So this sweeping act redistributed land and wealth, weakening monastic institutions and scattering those who remained loyal to Rome. However, Cromwell's evangelical leanings eventually led to his demise. In an unfortunate misstep, Cromwell tried to arrange a marriage between Henry and Anne of Cleves, which was not looked upon well by the king. He did not find her attractive enough. So amid court intrigues, Cromwell's critics exploited this error, and he was executed for treason in 1540, marking a turbulent turn as King Henry oscillated between punishing supporters of both Catholic and Protestant causes. King Henry truly couldn't make up his mind, so he just started burning everyone at the stake. In fact, at this time after Cromwell, he burned 3 Roman Catholics and 3 Protestants just to make a statement about his leanings. Now, another key figure of the English Reformation, who you've probably heard about, was William Tyndale, an Oxford scholar who translated the Bible into English. Now, this doesn't seem like a big deal to us today with all of our hundreds of English translations, but at the time, this was considered heretical by both the church and the English crown. The Bible was only available in Latin and meant to be accessible to clergy and to the elite. Now, a key point of contention in the Reformation, as you probably know, was that the Bible needed to be available to everyone in their own language. This was something that Luther really championed. So Tyndale's translation was something that made Scripture accessible to the English-speaking laity. And though he, being Tyndale, was exiled during his life and ultimately martyred for his work, his translation undergirded all English Bibles up until the 20th century. So it was a foundational translation. Before his execution in 1536, an estimated 16,000 copies of Tyndale's Bible entered England, despite the strict regulations. And his work set up a foundation that neither Henry nor his successors could erase. People were reading the Bible for themselves. Tyndale was unfortunately later choked to death and martyred for his faith and work in translating Scriptures. But the arrival of Tyndale's Bible inspired widespread reading and theological discussion. Thomas Cromwell and Cranmer supported this movement by recruiting and funding preachers, and Cromwell persuaded Henry to order English Bibles for parish churches. These acts only strengthened the evangelical commitments forming across the coasts of England and Scotland. And despite Henry's hostility towards Luther that remained throughout his life, a Protestant network was taking root in England, distinct from but influenced by continental Lutheranism. In Scotland, where trading links with the Baltic and northern Germany were strong, the connection to Lutheranism was direct and formative. But the work of the Reformation in England almost did not stick. When Queen Mary I, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, ascended to the English throne in 1553. Queen Mary quickly set about restoring Roman Catholicism after her half-brother, Edward VI, and one son of Henry VIII, had advanced Protestant reforms during their reign. Mary's ascension to the throne followed a tumultuous period. King Edward's supporters had attempted to prevent her from taking the throne by naming Lady Jane Grey as queen, but Mary ultimately gained strong public support and successfully claimed her right as the legitimate heir. But upon securing her position, Mary began immediately reversing Protestant reforms by establishing Catholic practices. She quickly reinstated the authority of the Pope, revived the traditional Mass, restored monasteries where it was possible, and implemented Catholic rituals and sacrament through England. And as expected, clergy in the churches were the ones who most suffered from this. They had to continue to oscillate back and forth between newfound Reformation principles and theology, now back to Roman Catholic theology. The icons that they were commanded to burn during the Protestant reign were now expected to be returned to the church. And if anyone did not comply, then they were burned at the stake as being sympathizers for Protestant ethos, never mind if they could simply not find the requisite materials. The British Parliament under Queen Mary passed laws repealing all of these Edwardian reforms, nullifying the Protestant Book of Common Prayer and revoking Edwardian doctrinal changes. And Mary worked closely with her husband, Philip II of Spain, and prominent Catholic advisors, including the Cardinal Reginald Pole, who helped guide her efforts to re-Catholicize England. But perhaps what Mary is most infamously known for was her persecution of the Protestants. Her aim was to cleanse England of all Protestant heresy and return it to Roman Catholic orthodoxy. So from 1555 to 1558, Mary burned nearly 300 Protestants at the stake, including prominent reformers like Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and even Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. These three martyrs are now famously referred to as the Oxford Martyrs, and this brutal campaign earned Mary the nickname Bloody Mary and left a lasting mark on her legacy. Now, just a few words on the Oxford Martyrs as we wrap up. Hugh Latimer was originally a Catholic priest, but later became a passionate reformer after embracing Protestant ideas. Known for his powerful preaching, which you can read a lot of today, he served as the Bishop of Worcester under Henry VIII, but under Mary's reign, Latimer was imprisoned for heresy. He was sentenced to death for refusing to recant his beliefs. Incidentally, Latimer was able to preach Reformation ideas from his pulpit in St. Edward King and Martyr Church in Cambridge, that's where my wife and I frequently attended church when I was in Cambridge. And the pulpit that he preached in still stands today and is used every Sunday. It's pretty remarkable to see. Latimer was able to preach Reformation doctrines from that pulpit because St. Edward King and Martyr was not officially part of the Diocese of Ely, and therefore the Bishop of Ely had no jurisdiction over the clergy and what they preached there. Instead, it was one of the collegiate churches owned by the university, and the university allowed those ideas to spread. Whereas Ridley, on the other hand, was a respected scholar and preacher, and he became Bishop of London, acting as a close advisor to King Edward VI. Ridley was instrumental in advancing Protestant reforms, advocating for the English Book of Common Prayer, and opposing traditional Catholic practices. The martyrdoms of Bishop Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley took place on October 16, 1555, in Oxford, England. Their martyrdom is often commemorated because as the flames began to engulf the men, Latimer famously encouraged Ridley with these words, saying, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England, as I trust shall never be put out." Their deaths became a powerful symbol of Protestant conviction and fueled the resolve of the English Reformation, with their candle representing a lasting commitment to Reformed faith in England. Mary's reign, however, was cut short when she died of illness in 1558, and her death marked the end of England's brief return to Roman Catholicism, and it opened the way for her half-sister, Elizabeth I, to take the throne. Queen Elizabeth I went on to reestablish Protestantism in what became known as the Elizabethan settlement, which permanently shifted England back to Protestantism and defined the religious character of the nation for all of the generations to come. So in conclusion, the history of the English Reformation is the result of several moving factors, many of which are tied up with monarchy and politics. The English Reformers, however, seized those opportunities when they arose and were able to change the tide of England's political and theological landscape forever. While the oscillating back and forth between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, the Anglican tradition developed a true Reformed Catholicity, which can be seen with the many shades of high and low churchmanship still in existence today. So when people ask me why I'm an Anglican, I often tell them it's because I think they struck that right balance between Reform and Catholicity.